Welcome to this special series of Advanced TV History, where we're going to take a long, glacial look at soap operas from their earliest days until the early 2010s, when so many of our shows went dark. We're able to tap today the research and analysis of one of America's foremost authorities on daytime dramas, Dr. Elana Levine from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Now, you may remember, listeners, Dr. Levine from two earlier episodes of Advanced TV History. They were entitled Daytime Drama's Place in TV History and also a posthumous profile of the awesome showrunner, Agnes Nixon. That was back in 2017, and at that time, Dr. Levine was knee-deep in the research for her book, just recently published by Duke University Press, entitled Her Stories. So in this four-parter, Dr. Levine and I look at how daytime dramas changed the way TV told stories. We take a fun look at the traumas and the dramas and the fantasy, and we talk about, too, how that storytelling, that process, actually evolved with technology. Later on, we'll take a look at realism and the social issues, those which were pioneered in daytime that ultimately benefited primetime TV viewing. We talk feminism, advertising, and market demographics, and hear Levine's conclusions on the decline of soap operas as a network storytelling platform, and how serials today fill the void. No cliffhangers, organ music, or striped couches, listeners. Just straight talk about the powerful world of soap operas with the super knowledgeable Dr. Levine. This is Advanced TV History, and I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. Oh, Dr. Levine, welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. I'm thrilled to be here.
It has been a long time coming, this book of yours. Tell us why how you decided you were ready to take on that which is almost impossible to accomplish, and how you weathered it.
Thanks. Well, I guess I had gotten to a point in my career where I was thinking about what the next project was going to be. And I knew I wanted to do historical research because I really enjoy doing that kind of research. And I knew that in the first book I'd written, which is called Wallowing in Sex, the New Sexual Culture of 1970s American Television, which is about the impact of the sexual revolution on American TV in that era, I had written a chapter about soap operas in the 70s and their rape storylines. And I really liked working on that chapter, and I was surprised when I did it how much I was able to uncover. And so I thought to myself, I think I can do it. I think I can write this book that's about the history of soap opera across all of its times on TV. And I kind of wanted the challenge, and I wanted to try and see if it was possible, because it seemed like it was impossible given the volume of material and how much of it had disappeared. And so I decided, okay, I'm at a point in my career, I have tenure, I'm pretty secure, I can start working on this and spend a really long time on this research, which I knew I would enjoy. And I could, do some other shorter term things along the way, which I did, and just give it the time that it needed to really delve into this project in depth. And so I did that. And I really spent more than 10 years intensively doing this research. Like I said, I did other things, other research projects in the interim, but they were all shorter term, and I was kind of consistently working on this throughout. So, the more I worked, the more I was convinced that I had a story here to tell. I had a ton of material and a ton of evidence to draw on. And it was, really became a challenge of how to shape that into the story I wanted to tell. That's part of the process too. Doing the research and investigating and kind of uncovering stuff is the fun part for me. Shaping it into a narrative and being able to support your claims is the really challenging part. But it happened eventually. And so I'm thrilled to see it come to fruition.
Well, we are too. And listeners, I'll just say that while it is a book that has a certain academic orientation, it is definitely readable. And what's more amazing is there's just so much to understand about the business and about how daytime drama evolved with what we understand to be the entertainment business. You can't even think about daytime and not end up learning from Dr. Levine exactly sort of how it helped shape TV and what we see today. Dr. Levine, you did a tremendous amount of research. It is inspiring to read this.
Thank you.
You also really helped us understand who some of the people were, who the big names were who shaped daytime. We perhaps never saw them except as their names rolled in the credits. So tell us a little bit about what you learned and what you think about Irna Phillips and Agnes Nixon and the Bells and others.
Yeah, these were, I've been a soap viewer much of my life. And I started when I was about 11 years old watching soap. So I was a teenager in the 80s reading a lot of soap magazines and really immersing myself in the world. And so I always knew who all these people were, but I really came to kind of understand them and in kind of an odd way, almost know them differently through doing this project. When you do historical research and you read things that these individuals themselves have written in memos, in notes, in scripts, in those kinds of, you really kind of get this sense of knowing them. And so that was one of the real joys of the project for me, was starting to really understand and get to know these folks in a different way. Irna Phillips is such a character. She's incredibly important to the history of soap opera as a storytelling form. Primarily, her biggest impact was in radio, because she really was one of the founders of this form in radio. And there's some great research about her work in radio. Because of that, and because my project was going to be focused mostly on TV, I didn't do a lot of research into her radio work myself, but there's a lot of original research into it. But, she's an incredible person and quite a character. She, of course, was also, though, really influential in transitioning the form to television. And I'm not sure she's gotten quite the credit that she deserves for that. Some of the research, some of the academic research about this before my book kind of suggests that she was more reluctant than my research showed that she was. In fact, I found that she was quite interested in transitioning her shows to TV once, she started to realize how significant television was going to be. And she herself, really took the initiative to convince Procter and Gamble, who owned shows that she was the writer for, that this was a workable form. She paid to make sample, videotape episodes. They weren't videotape, they were what's called kinescopes. But she made these kind of sample episodes of Guiding Light, which she had been writing for radio, to show them that it could work in TV. And she spent a whole lot of time thinking about what the TV versions should be like and how to tell these stories in TV without sacrificing what she knew about storytelling from radio. She really carried over these principles, which worked so effectively in radio, and she made them work in TV as well.
And now, Search for Tomorrow.
Agnes Nixon. And I'll say that Katie McLean and I had a quick conversation following the interview that I did with her. And I asked her whether or not, what she thought of Agnes Nixon, what she remembers about her, descriptive words. And she only had very kind things to say, that Agnes was incredibly smart, that she was so committed to the show, to the quality of the show, and that it was really her personality that ensured that there was a moral embedded into, most specifically from Katie's experience, All My Children, but in everything that Agnes did. And I know, Elana, you had a chance to meet with Agnes. So tell us just a little bit more about how you brought Agnes into this book.
Yeah, she's an incredibly important figure, Agnes is, to this whole history and to my book. She was a protege of Irna Phillips. She and Bill Bell were both Irna's basically employees and trainees. She basically taught them how to do this work. So they both, Bell and Nixon, both sort of take the Phillips tradition and develop it into their own projects eventually. And, that's, of course, incredibly important to the way that the form develops across TV history. But Agnes Nixon herself was an incredibly smart and clever and gifted storyteller. And so she learned certain principles and skills from Phillips, and then she got to kind of apply them herself to eventually her own original creation. She worked on a number of Phillips shows, and then she created All My Children and One Life to Live. And and then later Loving as well. But they, were really the place where she was able to really kind of let her own interests and ideas come through. And she was a really remarkable person. She was raised Catholic, and in the South, it was a pretty conservative upbringing. Yet she also had this strong kind of social justice mission, I guess. They do know that she really believed in what I think we would consider pretty progressive social justice kinds of causes, like racial equality and gender equality and those kinds of things. And she very artfully wove those missions into her storytelling. And it's very clear in the early years of both of those shows, One Life to Live and All My Children, how important that was and how skilled she was at marrying really compelling storytelling with these social justice causes in a way that did not feel like you were being lectured to at all, was just incredibly like tune in now kind of storytelling. She kind of held those two principles, I think, throughout her work and throughout her career. And it really shows. And she continued to have the most influence on All My Children. She was less involved with One Life to Live as the years went on. But All My Children, you can really see that at different points. And she comes in and out. We can, talk perhaps later about different periods, but she comes in and out of kind of having a direct hand in All My Children. And the moments when she's there, you see really interesting stories come up in greater force, I think, than when she's not there, particularly along these kind of social justice lines.
And William Bell. And wasn't he sort of situated out of Chicago?
He was, yes. So, Bill Bell was married to Lee Phillip Bell, who recently passed away. And she was, of course, a very well-known Chicago television personality. She had a talk show, and they lived in Chicago for many years. Irna Phillips herself was from Chicago, and she worked out of Chicago for most of her career. And I believe that that's where Bell started working for her, was in Chicago. And so the Bells, were located in Chicago. Bill Bell did most of his writing in Chicago, and eventually the family moved to the West Coast. Bill Bell was, before he created The Young and the Restless, which was his first show that he created, whole cloth, he was the head writer of Days of Our Lives for a lot of years too. And so he has a really important influence on that show, as well as on some of Irna Phillips' shows before that point. So they moved to the West Coast then, and he created Young and the Restless and then The Bold and the Beautiful. And both he and Lee Bell, I think, brought a lot of sort of Midwestern perspective. And of course, Bold and the Beautiful is a little different because it's very glamour focused, but The Young and the Restless is set in a kind of made-up Wisconsin city called Genoa City, which was, I think, loosely modeled after Lake Geneva, where I believe that they might have had a summer house. Yeah. Huh. So yeah, they are Chicagoans. I'm also a Chicagoan, so I'm proud to say that there's these important Chicago roots in soap history.
Well, and that's a great segue to our next topic within sort of the development. So listeners, we're really kind of focusing on the structure or the infrastructure that brought daytime to its pinnacle, its greatest popularity in the 80s and the early 90s. And what I guess I never totally understood was the difference of the Procter & Gamble sponsorship and then the network-owned shows, and how that even helped you understand whether or not it was a show that was shot in New York or ultimately LA. So tell us how those two aspects of differentiation are sort of aligned and helped build the empires of LA and New York storytelling, respectively.
So originally in radio, all daytime soaps, daytime dramas or serials, as they were typically called in radio, were owned and produced by sponsors. So by big domestic goods companies like Procter & Gamble or Colgate-Palmolive, those kinds of companies. And that's how a lot of radio worked, was the sponsors were the producers and owners of the shows. And so that was a pattern that was started in radio and carried over to all of TV, not just daytime. Procter & Gamble in particular was very well situated. I mean, they were the largest advertiser in all of broadcasting, but they were very well situated in daytime. And of course, they had tons and tons of brands, and their products were the sponsors of the main daytime soaps that transitioned into early TV. So Guiding Light, but even other shows that are no longer here, but like a show like Search for Tomorrow, which started on TV, didn't transition from radio, but it was original to TV in the early 50s, was a Procter & Gamble show. A huge number of the early soaps were owned by Procter & Gamble, and they were all produced in New York. New York was really the center of, again, all TV production in the very early 50s. And it took until a little bit later, in the later 50s, really, for Hollywood and LA to start to become the center of TV production in general. The soaps actually take a little bit longer to get to LA and to the West Coast, and to get beyond the sponsor ownership and control. All of TV starts to move away from sponsor ownership by the later 50s. But soaps and daytime is one of the few places where that stays. And Procter & Gamble owned shows like Guiding Light and As the World Turns their whole lives, until those shows went off the air. That's a very unusual, certainly by the 60s or 70s. There were no other shows on TV that were still owned by sponsors. Daytime was one of the few places where that legacy carried over from radio and stuck around, at least in some cases. But what happens starting in the 60s is that some soaps start to be produced in Hollywood, in Los Angeles on the West Coast. And that is a really big shift because that had not been the case before this time, although lots of other TV had started to be produced in Hollywood by then.
General Hospital. General Hospital.
The first show to do that was really General Hospital, which started in 1963. And part of what was unique about this was not only that it was produced on the West Coast as opposed to New York, it was owned by ABC. ABC was making its own soap operas, basically, starting with General Hospital in 1963. And that had not happened before this point. Soaps were only being made by sponsors. When GH is created in 1963, that's a big shift for lots of reasons, but a couple of them are the move to the West Coast and the ownership by the network as opposed to a sponsor. And then, as the years continued, there started to be a kind of third entity where a kind of independent production company would own and produce the soaps. So that was the case, for example, with Days of Our Lives, which started in 1965, and that was created by an independent production company. When I say independent, I mean not a network itself and not a sponsor. Sometimes it was a Hollywood studio or would be kind of acquired by a Hollywood studio, and sometimes it was an entirely independent company. That really kind of shifted the way that soaps were created and who was in control of them in ways that have lots of ripples and implications. And it's not like all the network-owned shows were in LA, because One Life to Live and All My Children eventually were owned by ABC, and they were produced in New York for almost their whole histories, except for All My Children for a short time towards the end. When it moved to Los Angeles. But there were still ABC-owned shows that were made in New York, but the West Coast starts to grow as a production center for soap opera, beginning in the 60s and building into the 70s. But New York never totally disappears. And one of the really sad things about the demise of so many soaps, including All My Children and One Life to Live and Guiding Light and As the World Turns, is that New York stopped being a production space for soap opera. And those jobs are just gone. There had been a lot of TV work in New York at one point, and in part through the soaps.
So the remaining soaps that we have today in 2020, mid-pandemic, and we won't even speculate what the economics of life once it's become a new normal will be for daytime drama. The remaining soaps are produced where?
All in Los Angeles.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's no New York production anymore. General Hospital, Days of Our Lives, Young and the Restless, and The Bold and the Beautiful are all produced in LA.
Wow.
The Guiding Light, presented by Ivory Soap, the most famous soap in the world, and Pure All Vegetable Crisco. It's digestible.
Oh, Doctor, that's quite a baby gallery.
I brought them into the world. Yes, I started them all on Ivory Soap. Some are grown up now.
Oh, there's a honey.
That's Jennifer. Today, she's a real beauty. Why, she poses for magazine covers.
Suppose Ivory is still her beauty soap?
I'm sure it is. This young lady is Lois. She was recently voted prettiest girl at her university.
Bet she's still using Ivory for her complexion. Every girl can have that Ivory look if she'll change to regular skin care and use Ivory soap. In 1 week, it'll bring a lovelier complexion.
I understand more doctors advise Ivory for complexion care.
The American economy and changed how it is that we even think about the home and the importance we place on a woman as a consumer. And you delve into that with your book, but just discuss a little bit about the role that daytime drama played in that.
The whole name soap opera, right, comes from the origins of those sponsorship companies. The fact that companies like Colgate-Palmolive and Procter & Gamble made a lot of the products that they made were soap. And so the name was initially quite derogatory because it was pairing those kind of very banal everyday goods with this kind of high elite form of opera, which was referring to the kind of melodrama of the storytelling. That combination was sort of a disparaging label for the form applied early on that has since become, I think, more just widely accepted. the form was, designed basically to sell those products, right? And so Procter & Gamble would create these soaps to be able to sell their soaps, have commercial messaging for their domestic goods products. And so much of the success of the form in radio was rooted in its ability to advertise these products to housewives who could be listening to the radio while they were doing their housework. And so one of the big issues with the transition of the form to television was that people were really concerned that women would not watch on TV because it would be too disruptive to their housework. Because in the early days of TV, everybody believed that you really had to sit and focus your eyes and attention on the screen. And of course, the screens were much smaller than they are today, and the images were much less crisp. And so there was some degree of truth to that. So a lot of the kind of anxiety from the world of marketing and even the TV world was about whether it would pay to have this form exist in television, or whether it really was a truly and exclusively radio form because it could be listened to while doing other things. So the transition to TV was really about convincing and the thinking process of those in the worlds of marketing and television and radio that this form could work and that it could still function effectively as a selling tool in the world of TV. And that involved some kind of shifts in thinking about what the woman's role in the home was and what these programs could provide for her that would still work in the interests of the sponsor's messaging.
That sort of leads right into then the question of the fact that the role of women as consumers, their place in the household as decision makers, as purchasers, was changing. The economics of a family was changing, and marketers were trying to seize this, but it feels to me like it was a very changing model. Like every year it was a little bit different. And then lo and behold, Betty Friedan publishes The Feminine Mystique and makes all women question or perhaps double down on their status quo, on what makes them comfortable and who they think they are within their own family. It's amazing that it turned out to be as successful as it was, and that perhaps it was that Irna Phillips and Agnes Nixon could also more quickly zero in on what people were thinking and in some cases guide women toward maybe what they should be thinking. I don't know. We talked about that in our last interview a couple of years ago, about whether or not they were setting a tone or whether they were responding to a tone.
Yeah, that's always a tricky question when you talk about media culture at all and what the chicken and egg, which comes first. And I think we're probably best off not trying to settle it once and for all because it's pretty impossible to know. But they clearly are working in concert, right? They're clearly in dialogue with each other, what the creators of content are doing and what the culture at large is doing. And it's, they're really mutually influential, which is a little bit of a cop-out on the question, but also is probably closer to the way it really works. The relationship between the creators and the society at large, I think it differs at different moments for different people. Someone like Irna Phillips was very conventional and traditional, and she's such an interesting figure in so many ways. She was never married. She adopted children. So she was a mother, but by adoption. She had this really influential and powerful career, but she really valued traditional roles for women above all else. And you can see that in her shows, right? She really talks, she really values a traditional family structure and women's roles as wives and mothers and those kinds of things. Although, of course, her own experience was so different from that there was clearly some tension there. And that definitely comes out in her soaps as well. I think she was in some ways resistant to a lot of the changing society. She was also just older. She'd been around for a longer time, and it often takes younger generations to push things in new directions. And yet even her, you can see some glimmers of the change coming through. One of my favorite examples in the book is when she created Another World in the mid-1960s. She, imagined the kind of matriarch character, the middle-aged mother of the family that was at the center of the program as having read The Feminine Mystique and starting to think about whether she wanted to, maybe take a job outside the home or those kinds of things. And so even though she was a very traditional wife and mother figure, Mary Matthews, I'm talking about the character on Another World, even Phillips was recognizing that this was a changing world and that she kind of needed to have even those kinds of characters be cognizant of the changes. But a lot of Phillips' shows, even in that era in the 60s, are really about this generational tension as younger generations are starting to push things in terms of lots of things, but definitely in terms of gender roles and how the older generation is responding to that. So just the fact that these programs would dramatize those tensions and those changes and challenges that the society was going through, I think that's where you really see their really rich engagement with the larger society, is how they represent those tensions. Nixon does the same thing, but Nixon is a little bit more on the new generation side of it, and seems a little more sympathetic to what is going on with the younger people. Mm-hmm. So there's that, you can see it literally in the generations of soap creators, just the same thing that was happening in terms of generational shifts in the society as a whole.
Yeah, and I'll just close out of that whole conversation about the generational shifts by saying that one could probably look to how the storylines were resonating with the cultural change that was going on. And listeners recognize that in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, I mean, I wouldn't exactly call America homogenous, but there was just far fewer opportunities to market to women, fewer ways for women to even see themselves on TV. And so daytime did become a factor, whether you really had ever thought of yourself as needing your stories or not. It was something to see. And whether you were in college or, home with kids or taping it and watching it at night when you came home from your work, it was just part of life. Listeners, we hope this has provided you a little escape from your day. Find Dr. Levine's book wherever you buy books. It's entitled Her Stories, published by Duke University Press 2020. Follow Elana on Twitter at EHL. Audio clips used today are all found on YouTube, which is a veritable boneyard of daytime dream sequences. Music on Advanced TV Herstory is and always will be Jazzer's Take Me Higher, found at Free Music Archive. Catherine Yang is at the controls, delivering tight talk and soft sound. Browse the archives wherever you find podcasts, at YouTube, Spotify, or Pandora, or head over to tvherstory.com to learn more about who we are and why we podcast. While you're at it, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter and know that we will never share your address with anyone. Her stories, their stories, whatever you call them, they're an important part of Advanced TV Herstory, and it's why I podcast. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.